Ethan strode through the quad, juggling a towering stack of books and his laptop bag, the cool breeze doing little to soothe his fraying nerves. His mind was already on their next project deadline, and he muttered reminders to himself as he hurried to the library. Pausing at the entrance, he caught sight of Sebastian leaning casually against a pillar, chatting with another student Ethan vaguely recognized from one of their classes. The sight was nothing out of the ordinary. Sebastian was always surrounded by admirers, his effortless charm drawing people like moths to a flame. But as Ethan drew closer, fragments of their conversation reached his ears. "I've been doing most of the heavy lifting," Sebastian was saying, his voice low but distinct. "Ethan tries, but honestly, it's like herding cats sometimes. I just want to get it done right." Ethan stopped in his tracks, his stomach plummeting. His mind spiraled, replaying Sebastian's words. Was that really how Sebastian saw him? A hindrance? A burden? Sebastian glanced up then, meeting Ethan's eyes for a split second. Ethan quickly turned and walked in the opposite direction, his chest tightening. By the time their next meeting rolled around, Ethan's mood had soured completely. He was curt and cold, brushing off Sebastian's attempts at conversation, and keeping his focus solely on the work. "What's with you today?" Sebastian finally asked, breaking the strained silence. "Nothing," Ethan said flatly, not looking up from his notebook. Sebastian frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You've been acting weird since the other day. Did I do something?" Ethan's pen stilled, his jaw tightening. He glanced up, his eyes sharp. "Don't pretend like you don't know." Sebastian blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" Ethan slammed his pen down, the sound echoing through the empty study room. "I heard you, Sebastian, talking to your friend about how I'm useless and dragging you down. If that's how you feel, why don't you just do the project on your own?" Sebastian's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in annoyance. "Wait a second. You think, Ethan, that's not what I meant?" "Oh, sure, because saying someone's hard to work with is a compliment," Ethan snapped, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Sebastian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're twisting my words. What I said was taken completely out of context, but of course you're too stubborn to listen to an explanation, aren't you?" Ethan shot to his feet as well, his face red with anger. "You're so full of yourself. You don't even realize how condescending you sound half the time. God forbid someone doesn't meet your impossibly high standards. And you're so insecure," Sebastian fired back, his voice rising, "that you jump to conclusions and assume everyone's against you." The room fell into a tense silence, their harsh words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Ethan turned to leave, his emotions boiling over. "You know what? Forget it. This was a mistake." But before he could take another step, Sebastian's hand shot out, gripping Ethan's wrist. The sudden contact made Ethan freeze, his heart thudding in his chest. "Let go of me," Ethan said through gritted teeth, refusing to meet Sebastian's gaze. "Not until you stop running away and actually listen," Sebastian said firmly, his voice low and controlled. Ethan turned to glare at him, ready to snap back, but the intensity in Sebastian's eyes stopped him short. They stood there, locked in a charged silence, their faces inches apart. "Why do you always assume the worst about me?" Sebastian asked quietly, his fingers still wrapped around Ethan's wrist. Ethan's breath hitched, caught off guard by the vulnerability in Sebastian's tone. His anger faltered, replaced by confusion, and something he couldn't quite name. "Because you make it so easy," Ethan finally muttered, his voice softer now. Sebastian's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. "Maybe if you stopped seeing me as your enemy for 5 seconds, you'd realize I don't hate you as much as you think." Ethan's eyes widened, his thoughts scrambling to make sense of Sebastian's words. The tension between them grew unbearable until Ethan finally pulled his wrist free, taking a step back. His heart was racing, and he hated how unsteady he felt under Sebastian's gaze. I need some air," Ethan stammered, turning and practically fleeing the room. Sebastian stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before sitting back down and staring at the open notebook in front of him. Ethan didn't go far, collapsing onto a bench outside the library. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. His emotions were a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and something uncomfortably close to guilt. Sebastian's words replayed in his mind. I don't hate you as much as you think. Had he been wrong about Sebastian all along? He groaned, leaning back and staring up at the night sky. The stars were faint against the city's glow, but their quiet presence offered a small comfort. For so long he'd seen Sebastian as an insufferable rival, someone whose sole purpose seemed to be making his life harder. But tonight, for the first time, Ethan saw a different side of him, one that was just as flawed, just as human. It was a realization that left Ethan more unsettled than he cared to admit. Ethan's steps faltered as he approached the cherry blossom tree Sebastian had mentioned in his message. It stood near the edge of the university campus, its branches heavy with delicate pink petals. The sight was almost surreal, the soft rustling of the breeze carrying the scent of spring. He spotted Sebastian leaning casually against the trunk, his hands shoved into the pockets of his blazer. Ethan hesitated. Their last argument had left him shaken, and the idea of facing Sebastian again so soon filled him with equal parts anxiety and curiosity. But then Sebastian turned, his gaze meeting Ethan's. He straightened, a small, almost hesitant smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You came, Sebastian said simply. Didn't give me much of a choice, Ethan muttered, but his tone lacked the usual bite. Sebastian motioned to the bench beneath the tree. Sit? After a moment's pause, Ethan nodded and joined him. The silence stretched, as they both stared at the ground, neither sure how to begin. Finally, Sebastian broke the stillness. Look, about the other day. I'm sorry for what I said or what you think I said. I wasn't trying to dismiss you or your work. You're good at what you do. I was just venting, and it came out wrong. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the apology. He studied Sebastian's face, searching for any sign of insincerity, but found none. Okay, Ethan said slowly, but for the record, you sounded like a complete jerk. Sebastian chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Fair enough. I guess I deserve that. Ethan's lips twitched, but he quickly hid the smile. Why are you doing this anyway? Apologizing under a cherry blossom tree feels a little extra, even for you. Sebastian shrugged, his gaze drifting upwards to the canopy of pink blooms. I figured we needed a fresh start, and this seemed like a good place for it. Did he try? Ethan followed his gaze, watching as petals fluttered gently to the ground. The sight was oddly calming, and for the first time in days, the tension in his shoulders eased. They sat quietly for a while, the awkwardness between them giving way to a tentative peace. You know, Ethan began, his voice softer now, I don't actually think you're perfect. Far from it, actually. Sebastian smirked. Gee, thanks. That's heartwarming. No, I mean, Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. You act like you got everything together, like nothing ever gets to you. It's frustrating. Sebastian tilted his head, his smirk fading. Is that what you think? That I don't feel pressure? Well, yeah, Ethan admitted. You're smart, confident, everyone likes you. You make it look easy. Sebastian let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. If only. The truth is, I'm terrified of failing, of not living up to everyone's expectations. It's exhausting, but if I don't keep up the act, I feel like everything will fall apart. Ethan stared at him, surprised by the vulnerability in Sebastian's words. It was a side of him Ethan had never seen before, one that made him seem less like an untouchable rival and more like a real person. What about you? Sebastian asked, turning the question back on Ethan. Ethan hesitated, unsure if he wanted to lay his insecurities bare, but something about the quiet intimacy of the moment made him speak. I've always felt like I had to prove myself, he admitted. My brother was the golden child, straight A's, star athlete, perfect everything. No matter what I did, it was never enough to get out of his shadow. Sebastian was silent for a moment before saying, That sounds rough. Ethan shrugged, though his expression was pained. It's whatever. I guess I don't like feeling overshadowed again. Like, I'm not good enough. Sebastian leaned back against the tree, his expression thoughtful. For what it's worth, I think you're more than good enough, even if you do have a habit of being insufferable. Ethan blinked, then laughed, a short, startled sound that made Sebastian smile. As the tension eased, a cherry blossom petal drifted down, landing in Ethan's hair. Sebastian noticed it immediately and leaned closer, brushing the petal away with a careful hand. Their fingers brushed, and Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. There, Sebastian said, his voice quieter now. Got it? Ethan's cheeks warmed, and he quickly turned his head away. You didn't have to do that. Sebastian smirked, leaning back. You are blushing. I am not. Ethan shot back, but his flustered tone betrayed him. Sebastian chuckled, the sound light and genuine. Relax, Ward. It's just a petal. Ethan muttered something under his breath, but he couldn't stop the faint smile that tugged at his lips. They lapsed into another comfortable silence, watching as the blossoms swayed in the breeze. For once, there was no bickering, no tension, just a peaceful camaraderie that felt strangely right. You know, Ethan said after a while, his voice soft, you're not so bad when you're not being a know-it-all. Sebastian chuckled, glancing at him. And you're tolerable when you're not being insufferable. Ethan rolled his eyes, but couldn't help the grin spreading across his face. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could be more than rivals. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the campus, Ethan and Sebastian sat side by side, their usual walls slowly crumbling in the presence of falling petals and unspoken truths. Ethan tapped his pen against his notebook, his foot bouncing under the library table. Across from him, Sebastian scrolled through an article on his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. The quiet hum of the library filled the air, punctuated by the occasional turning of a page, or the soft footsteps of students searching the shelves. You know, Ethan said, breaking the silence, if you frown any harder, your face might get stuck that way. Sebastian's head shot up, his lips twitching into a smirk. And here I thought you were too busy pretending to work to notice. Ethan rolled his eyes, but couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at his lips. I'm not pretending. I'm multitasking, something you wouldn't understand. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Oh, please. You've been staring at the same sentence for the past 10 minutes. What's the matter? Too stubborn to ask for help? Ethan shot him a glare. I don't need your help. Sure you don't? Sebastian's smirk deepened as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a teasing whisper. Recklessly stubborn, as always. The playful banter continued, the tension between them mounting with each passing moment. Sebastian's teasing tone, the way his eyes lingered on Ethan's face a little too long. It was all starting to feel different. Ethan could feel his pulse quicken, his usual comebacks faltering under Sebastian's gaze. Can we just focus on the project? He said, his voice sharper than he intended. Sebastian raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by Ethan's flustered tone. All right, Ward, whatever you say. He stood and moved toward the bookshelf behind them, scanning the titles for a reference they needed. Ethan tried to focus on his notes, but his mind kept drifting. The way Sebastian's shirt fit perfectly against his back, the way his fingers grazed the spines of the books. It was maddening. Ethan shook his head, forcing himself to look away. Get it together, he thought. A moment later, Sebastian returned with a book in hand, setting it on the table with a thud. This might help, he said, but his tone held a teasing edge, assuming you actually plan to read it. Ethan groaned. I don't know why I agreed to work with you. Because deep down you know I'm right, Sebastian said, leaning closer. The proximity made Ethan's breath hitch. He looked up, finding Sebastian's face mere inches from his own. The smirk was still there, But there was something else in Sebastian's eyes, something intense, almost vulnerable. "Sebastian," Ethan began, his voice faltering, "what are you—" Before he could finish, Sebastian stepped closer, effectively cornering Ethan against the bookshelf. The playful banter evaporated, replaced by a charged silence that made Ethan's heart race. "You drive me insane, Ward," Sebastian said, his voice low and rough. "Do you have any idea what it's like to fight this?" Ethan blinked, his mind scrambling to process Sebastian's words. "Fight? What?" Sebastian let out a bitter laugh, his hands braced on either side of Ethan. "This, you. Every time we argue, every time you look at me like you're ready to tear me apart, I can't stop thinking about you." Ethan's throat went dry. "If this is some kind of joke—" "It's not," Sebastian interrupted, his voice firm. "You're the only one who makes me forget everything else." The weight of Sebastian's confession hung between them, thick and suffocating. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. "This doesn't make any sense," Ethan stammered. "We hate each other." "Do we?" Sebastian challenged, his eyes searching Ethan's face. "Because I think we've been lying to ourselves for a long time." Before Ethan could respond, Sebastian leaned in, capturing his lips in a sudden, desperate kiss. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. For a moment, Ethan froze, his mind unable to keep up with what was happening. But then, the heat of Sebastian's lips, the sheer intensity of the kiss, broke through his hesitation. Slowly, almost tentatively, Ethan responded, his hands gripping the edge of the bookshelf for support. Books tumbled to the floor around them, but neither of them noticed. The kiss deepened, their rivalry forgotten in the haze of newfound emotions. Sebastian's hands moved to cup Ethan's face, his touch surprisingly gentle. Ethan's heart felt like it might burst as he leaned into the kiss, his usual defenses crumbling in the face of Sebastian's sincerity. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Ethan's cheeks were flushed, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and something else, something he wasn't ready to name. Sebastian stepped back, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said, though his voice lacked any real regret. "I couldn't hold it in anymore." Ethan stared at him, struggling to find the right words. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Sebastian replied, his usual confidence tempered by a flicker of vulnerability. "Just think about it." The rest of the study session was a blur. Ethan barely remembered gathering his things or walking out of the library. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and a strange, undeniable warmth that refused to fade. He replayed the kiss in his mind over and over, each time feeling the same flutter in his chest. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But for the first time, Ethan found himself wanting to understand. As he lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, Sebastian's words echoed in his mind. "You're the only one who makes me forget everything else." And for the first time, Ethan wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something worth exploring in the feelings they'd both been avoiding for so long.